Under Nevada's scorching sun, Steven Seagal's motorcycle rumbled to silence. A desperate whimper pierced the desert air. There, beneath an ancient Joshua tree, hung a young girl with a horrifying sign above her head. Steven Seagal cut the engine of his black Harley-Davidson, his weathered leather boots hitting the sun-baked Nevada desert floor. The silence stretched endlessly, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk and the settling tick of cooling metal. His graying goatee caught the harsh light as he squinted toward the sound that had made him stop, a whimper, barely human, threading through the desert wind. He moved with the calculated precision of a man who'd spent decades in combat zones, his long hair tied back in its signature ponytail, black leather jacket creaking with each step. Through the scattered Joshua trees and desert sage, he followed the sound until he reached a clearing dominated by an ancient, gnarled Joshua tree. What he saw there made his blood freeze. She hung suspended by rope around her wrists, her body limp as a discarded marionette, bare feet barely grazing the rocky ground. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate gasps. Above her head, nailed to the twisted trunk, a crude wooden sign screamed its message in blood-red paint, "White man don't forgive." Steven's jaw clenched, his hand instinctively moving to the tactical knife on his belt. The sign's hateful words seemed to pulse in the desert heat, but another weak moan from the girl shattered his hesitation. "Not all of us," he growled, sliding the razor-sharp blade through the coarse rope with one decisive cut. She collapsed forward, and he caught her slight frame against his chest, feeling the fever burning through her torn clothing. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, frightened, unfocused with pain and dehydration. He lowered her gently to the ground, his movements careful and deliberate. "Easy now," his deep voice rumbled softly as he unscrewed the cap of his water bottle. "You're safe." He tilted a few drops against her cracked, swollen lips, watching as she tried to swallow. The ride back to his compound took 30 minutes across the desert terrain. Steven had built his training facility in the middle of nowhere for a reason: privacy, security, and a kind of isolation that let him forget the world existed. The main building was a converted military surplus structure, reinforced concrete and steel that could withstand anything nature or man threw at it. He carried her inside to the medical bay, a fully equipped room that had seen its share of training injuries over the years. Laying her on the examination table, he began assessing her condition with the methodical care of someone who'd patched up wounded soldiers in foreign deserts. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where the rope had cut deep, her legs scraped and bruised from struggling. Dehydration had left her skin paper thin, her lips split and bleeding. But it was the look in her eyes that hit him hardest, the hollow stare of someone who'd seen too much, lost too much. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, more to fill the oppressive silence than expecting a response. He filled a basin with warm water, adding antiseptic, then knelt beside the table. Dipping a clean cloth, he began washing the dust and dried blood from her skin with movements that were surprisingly gentle for hands that had broken so many bones in their time. She watched him work, those dark eyes tracking his every motion, but she didn't pull away. When he cleaned the rope burns on her wrists, she winced but stayed still. When he wrapped her feet in soft bandages, she let him, though her whole body remained coiled like a spring. "I'm going to call you Maya," he said finally, studying her face in the harsh fluorescent light. She looked to be in her early 20s, with the high cheekbones and bronze skin that spoke of Native American heritage. Strong but quiet. "That suit you?" She didn't answer, but something flickered in her expression, not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of it. He pulled a blanket up to her chin and stepped back. "Guest room's down the hall, but you stay here tonight where I can keep an eye on you." He grabbed his sleeping bag from a storage closet. "I'll be right outside that door. Anyone wants to get to you, they go through me first." As he settled onto the floor outside the medical bay, Steven stared up at the ceiling and wondered what kind of hell this girl had escaped from. And why someone had felt the need to leave her hanging like a warning sign in the middle of his desert. 3 days passed in careful routine. Maya, if that's what she wanted to be called, ate little, spoke less, but gradually began to trust that Steven meant what he said about protection. She watched him go through his morning training routines, observed how he moved with deadly precision through combat forms that had been honed over decades of fighting. On the fourth morning, Stephen found fresh boot prints in the sand near his motorcycle garage. Military issue, size 11, with the distinctive tread pattern of standard federal law enforcement footwear. Someone had been scouting his compound in the night. That evening, as the desert sunset painted the sky in shades of fire, two black SUVs approached his gate. Stephen watched them through his security cameras, his jaw tightening as he recognized the type, federal agents, probably FBI or ATF, the kind who came asking questions that weren't really questions. He met them at the front door, arms crossed over his chest, every inch the intimidating figure that had made him famous on movie screens and feared in real-world confrontations. Steven Seagal. The lead agent was a thin man in his 40s, with the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time behind a desk. His partner hung back, hand resting casually on his sidearm. Depends who's asking. Agent Morrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. He flashed his badge with practiced efficiency. We're tracking a fugitive, and we have reason to believe she might be in this area. Morrison handed him a folded piece of paper. Stephen unfolded it to reveal a police sketch, crude but recognizable. The drawing showed a young Native American woman with high cheekbones and dark eyes. Below the image, bold letters proclaimed, "Wanted for murder and armed escape. Reward $50,000. Stephen's expression didn't change as he studied the paper, but inside, his blood ran cold. $50,000 was serious money, the kind of bounty that brought out every amateur bounty hunter and desperate criminal within a 100-mile radius. "Can't say I recognize her," he said finally, handing the paper back. "You sure about that?" Morrison pressed, his eyes narrowing. "Small, early 20s, Native American features. We have intelligence suggesting she was rescued from somewhere near Joshua Tree National Forest. That's pretty close to your place here." Stephen's voice remained steady, betraying nothing. "I see a lot of Joshua trees out here, Agent Morrison. Haven't seen any fugitives." The second agent stepped forward, his tone more aggressive. "Mr. Seagal, this isn't some Hollywood movie. This woman is extremely dangerous. She's connected to a violent anti-government cell that's been targeting federal installations and personnel. That sign they left at the scene. They mean business." "What sign?" Morrison's smile was cold. "The one that said, 'White man don't forgive.' Ring any bells now?" Stephen kept his expression neutral, though every instinct screamed at him to end this conversation with violence. Still drawing a blank. "Here's the thing," Morrison continued, stepping closer. "We know she was found hanging from a tree with that sign above her. We know someone cut her down. And we know that someone brought her to medical attention." He gestured toward the compound. "You've got a pretty sophisticated medical setup here. Former military, combat medic training. Fits the profile." "Profile of what?" "Someone with both the skills and the bleeding heart mentality to rescue a terrorist." The word hung in the desert air like a challenge. Stephen felt his hands clench into fists, felt the familiar surge of rage that had gotten him in trouble more times than he could count. But he forced himself to remain still. "I think this conversation is over," he said finally. Morrison nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Seagal. And if I were you, I'd think real hard about harboring fugitives. The penalties are severe, even for movie stars." The agents climbed back into their SUVs and drove away, leaving twin dust clouds hanging in the still air. Stephen watched until their taillights disappeared, then turned to find Maya standing in the doorway behind him. She'd heard everything. "They came looking," he said simply. "Showed me a wanted poster. Said you were connected to some kind of terrorist cell." She didn't speak, but he saw the fear flicker across her face. "I told them I'd never seen you," he continued. "I don't know what you did, Maya, but out here, a man makes his choices. I made mine. The next afternoon, Maya stepped outside on her own for the first time since Stephen had brought her to the compound. She moved carefully, still favoring her injured feet, but with purpose. In a cleared patch of sand near the training area, she knelt and began drawing with a piece of charred wood from Stephen's fire pit. Stephen watched from the shade of the building's overhang, giving her space but staying alert. In the sand, she sketched with surprising skill, a large bird with wings spread wide, surrounded by flames that seemed to dance even in the static medium of the desert floor. "What is that?" he asked, approaching slowly so as not to startle her. "Eagle in fire," she said, her voice still rough from days of silence. "My family's symbol." She touched the center of the drawing with reverence. "This was my father's mark. Our people's mark." Her voice carried the weight of loss, and Stephen felt something shift in his chest. He'd heard that tone before, in the voices of soldiers who'd lost their units, their brothers, their reasons for fighting. "Tell me," he said simply. Maya's hand trembled as she continued drawing, adding details to the burning eagle. "My father was Joseph Crow Feather. Not a war chief, not a troublemaker. He taught our children the old ways, led our ceremonies. We lived on the reservation, but we kept the sacred places in the mountains." She paused, gathering strength. "Last spring, they found a white woman dead near our traditional hunting grounds. Sarah Kellerman, a photographer from back east. Her husband claimed she was murdered by Indians, said we were angry about her taking pictures of sacred sites." Stephen crouched beside her, listening intently. "But he killed her," Maya continued, her voice gaining strength. "Everyone on the reservation knew it. She'd been asking questions about missing federal money, about contracts that were supposed to help our people but never did. Her own husband was involved in the corruption. When she got too close to the truth, she didn't need to finish. Stephen had seen enough government corruption to fill his own nightmares. So they blamed your people instead. Federal agents came with local law enforcement. Said they had evidence of our involvement. They demanded we turn over the killers or face collective punishment." Her voice cracked. "My father stood up in the council meeting. He said we had done nothing wrong, that we would not confess to crimes we didn't commit." Maya's hands shook as she added more details to the drawing, smaller figures around the eagle, a family being torn apart. They came at dawn 3 days later. Military vehicles, helicopters, the full assault. Said we were resisting federal authority, harboring terrorists. They burned our ceremonial lodge with the elders still inside. Shot my 2 younger brothers when they tried to run. My mother. She stopped, unable to continue for a moment. They found my father's body hanging from the flagpole at the tribal council building. The same rope, the same knot they used on me. And that sign, "White man don't forgive," they nailed it to the pole above him. Stephen felt rage building in his chest, the kind of cold fury that had made him dangerous in his younger days. "And you?" "I was hiding in the old root cellar when they came. Stayed there for 2 days after the shooting stopped. When I finally came out." She gestured to the drawing, which now showed a landscape of destruction. "Nothing left but ashes and bodies. How did you end up hanging from that tree?" Maya's eyes hardened. "I was trying to reach the highway, to get to the next reservation and tell them what really happened. A patrol found me. The leader, a sergeant named Collins, he recognized me from the family photos in our burned house. He said I was the last witness, the last one who could tell the truth about what they'd done." She met Stephen's eyes directly for the first time. "They weren't trying to capture me. They were trying to make me disappear. The hanging, the sign, it was supposed to look like revenge, like that the savage Indians were finally showing their true nature." Stephen reached out and placed his hand over hers, both of them touching the sand drawing. "But you survived. Because you cut me down." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why? Why risk everything for a stranger?" Stephen stared at the burning eagle in the sand, seeing in it echoes of his own past. Because I know what it's like to fail someone who needed saving. That night, the silence between them felt different, charged with shared pain and the beginning of something neither had expected. Maya sat across from Stephen at his simple kitchen table, the harsh fluorescent light casting sharp shadows on both their faces. "You want to know why I understand?" Stephen asked, his voice rougher than usual. "Why I couldn't just ride past that tree." Maya nodded, sensing this was territory he rarely shared with anyone. 15 years ago, I had a sister. Younger, idealistic, the kind of person who believed she could change the world through documentary filmmaking. He stared into his coffee cup as if seeing the past reflected there. She was investigating illegal arms sales, following money trails that led back to some very dangerous people. Stephen's jaw tightened. "She called me one night, scared, said she'd gotten too close and needed help. I was in the middle of filming, had contracts, obligations. Told her to lay low for a few days until I could get free." The weight of regret hung heavy in his voice. "They found her body in a motel room in Bakersfield. Made it look like a drug overdose, but I knew better. She'd never touched drugs in her life." Maya reached across the table, her fingers brushing his scarred knuckles. "You couldn't have known. I could have dropped everything and gone to her. I could have put her safety above my career, my image, my Hollywood bullshit." His eyes met hers. "I didn't save her because I was too wrapped up in being Steven Seagal, action hero, to be Steven Seagal, big brother." The raw honesty in his voice stripped away all pretense between them. Maya stood and walked around the table, stopping directly in front of him. "If I had been white," she said quietly, "if I'd been some blonde photographer instead of a Native American woman, would you still have cut that rope?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Stephen stood, facing her, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "I don't love skin color," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love what breathes underneath it. I love courage, and strength, and the will to survive when everything's been taken from you." Maya's breath caught as he reached up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "You remind me that there's still something worth fighting for in this world." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. When she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I haven't felt safe in so long. Haven't felt anything good." The kiss was tentative at first, testing, questioning. Then deeper, as if both of them were remembering how to feel something other than pain and anger. When they broke apart, Maya pressed her forehead against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her like something precious and fragile. Their moment was shattered by the sound of vehicles approaching. Stephen's security system chimed, and he moved to the monitor, Maya close behind him. 3 pickup trucks, local plates, men with rifles clearly visible. "Sheriff's Department?" Maya asked. "Worse. Freelancers." Stephen's voice was grim. "Bounty hunters, or just locals who think $50,000 is worth more than doing the right thing." The lead truck stopped just outside the gate, and a man with a tin badge stepped out. Stephen recognized him, Joe Prescott, a local who'd appointed himself some kind of auxiliary law enforcement officer and spent most of his time harassing anyone who didn't look like his idea of a proper American. "Seagal." Prescott's voice carried across the desert. "We know you got her in there. The Apache girl. There's a federal bounty, and we aim to collect." Stephen stepped outside, Maya staying hidden behind the reinforced door. "You're on private property, Prescott. Turn around and go home. This ain't about property rights, movie star. This is about harboring a terrorist." Prescott spat into the sand, his hand resting on his sidearm. "We got legal authority to search for fugitives. You got a warrant?" Prescott's laugh was ugly. "This ain't Hollywood, Seagal. Out here, we handle things different." The standoff stretched taut as wire, 8 armed men facing one, but Stephen had been in worse odds before. His reputation wasn't built on movie stunts alone. Tell you what, Steven said, his voice carrying the quiet menace that had made him legendary. You boys get back in those trucks and drive away, and nobody gets hurt. You try to force your way onto my land. He let the threat hang unfinished. After a long moment, Prescott jerked his head toward his men. They climbed back into their vehicles, but his final words carried clearly, "This ain't over, Seagal. That bounty's too good to pass up." That night, Steven retrieved the hateful wooden sign from where he'd stored it as evidence. In the fire pit behind his compound, he struck a match and watched the flames consume the words, "White man don't forgive." Maya stood beside him, her shoulder touching his, both of them watching hatred turn to ash. "They'll be back," she said softly. "I know." Steven put his arm around her waist. "Which means we need to leave. Soon." Dawn came too quickly, bringing with it the thick stillness that preceded violence. Steven had felt it before in a dozen combat zones, the electric tension when death hung in the air like humidity. "We move tonight," he told Maya as they packed supplies into saddlebags for his motorcycle. "There's a place across the Mexican border, people who'll help us disappear until this blows over." Maya sealed a bag of medical supplies, her movements efficient despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "How far?" 150 miles south. "We travel fast, stay off the main roads, we can make it by morning." She turned to face him, something vulnerable flickering across her features. "Steven, when we get there, when we're safe." She took a breath. "I want to be more than just someone you rescued." He stopped packing, giving her his full attention. "I want to live," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I want to live as your woman. As your wife, if you'll have me." The words hit him harder than any physical blow. In her eyes, he saw not just desire but hope, the kind of desperate, precious hope that could sustain two people through any darkness. He crossed to her, taking her hands in his scarred ones. "Maya. I know it's crazy. I know we barely know each other. But I also know that in 3 days, you've shown me more kindness and protection than I've had in my entire life." Her voice cracked slightly. "I don't want to just survive anymore. I want to live." Steven pulled her against him, his lips finding hers in a kiss that tasted of promise and desperation and the kind of love that bloomed in impossible circumstances. "Yes," he whispered against her mouth. "Yes to all of it." They rode out under a canopy of stars, Steven's Harley purring through the desert night. Maya's arms were wrapped tight around his waist, her body pressed against his back as they carved through the darkness. The border was still 80 miles away when the first shot cracked across the desert. Steven felt the bullet tear through his shoulder, his body jerking forward over the handlebars. The motorcycle wobbled dangerously before he regained control, but blood was already soaking through his leather jacket. "Steven!" Maya's scream cut through the engine noise. "Hold on." He gunned the engine, zigzagging through the sparse vegetation as more shots rang out. In his mirrors, he could see headlights, 2, maybe 3 vehicles in pursuit. Another bullet shattered his left mirror. Steven gritted his teeth against the burning pain in his shoulder and pushed the Harley to its limits. They crested a small rise, and he saw their salvation, a narrow canyon cutting between 2 rocky outcroppings, too narrow for vehicles but wide enough for the motorcycle. He aimed for the gap as bullets whined past their heads. The Harley's engine screamed in protest as they bounced over rough ground, but they made it into the canyon just as their pursuers reached the ridge. 50 yards into the narrow passage, Steven's strength finally gave out. The motorcycle slewed sideways and went down, both riders tumbling across sand and rock. Steven rolled to protect Maya, his body taking the worst of the impact. "Steven!" Maya scrambled to where he lay, blood pooling beneath his shoulder. "Oh God, you're bleeding so much." "Keep going," he gasped, trying to push himself upright. "Canyon leads to the main road. Flag down a truck, get to the border. I'm not leaving you. Maya, listen to me." "No." Her voice was fierce, determined. "You didn't leave me hanging on that tree, and I'm not leaving you bleeding in this canyon." She got her shoulder under his good arm and hauled him upright through sheer force of will. Together, they stumbled deeper into the canyon as shouts echoed behind them. The pursuers had reached the entrance, but they were on foot now, picking their way carefully through the darkness. Stephen's vision grayed at the edges, but Maya's voice kept him moving. "Stay with me," she whispered urgently. "You asked me to be your wife. I said yes. That means you don't get to die on me now." They reached a wider area where the canyon walls created natural shelter. Stephen collapsed against the rocks, his breathing labored but steady. "Maya," he managed, looking up at her with wonder despite the pain. "You said yes." She knelt beside him, pressing her hands against his wound. "I meant it. Every word." 6 months later, morning sunlight filtered through the windows of a small adobe house nestled in the hills south of the Mexican border. Stephen sat propped against pillows, his shoulder fully healed but bearing a new scar to add to his collection. The bullet had missed anything vital, but it had taken weeks of careful nursing to get him back on his feet. Maya, he still thought of her by that name sometimes, though he was learning to call her by her real one, moved around their simple kitchen with quiet efficiency. Her belly showed the gentle curve of early pregnancy, and Stephen found himself watching her with the kind of contentment he'd never thought possible. "Tell me something true," he said, the same words he'd spoken every morning for the past month. She smiled, placing a hand over her heart in their daily ritual. "My name is Ayana Crowfeather," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her native language. "It means, eternal blossom, in my grandmother's tongue." "Ayana," Stephen repeated, tasting the syllables like something sacred. "You're the only beautiful thing that's ever grown in my life." She came to sit beside him on their simple bed, taking his hand and placing it over her small but noticeable bump. "Not the only thing." Through the window, they could see the small ranch they were building together. Stephen had used his Hollywood connections to quietly purchase the land through intermediaries, creating a place where they could exist without drawing attention from either the American authorities or the Mexican government officials who might ask uncomfortable questions. It wasn't much, 50 acres of scrubland with a reliable well and enough privacy to see trouble coming from miles away. But it was theirs, bought with honest money and built with their own hands. "The baby's going to need a name," Ayana said, leaning against his shoulder. "Something that honors both sides. What do you think?" She was quiet for a moment, considering. "For a boy, maybe Joseph Stephen. After my father and you." Stephen felt his throat tighten. He'd never expected to be a father, had written off that possibility years ago when his lifestyle and career had consumed everything personal in his life. "And for a girl?" "Elena Sarah. For your sister and the woman whose death started all this." It was perfect, Stephen realized. A way to honor the dead while creating something new and hopeful. In the distance, dust rose from the dirt road that led to their property. Stephen tensed automatically, old reflexes kicking in, but Ayana squeezed his hand. "It's just Miguel," she said calmly. "He's bringing supplies from town." Miguel Rodriguez was their nearest neighbor and closest thing to a friend in their new life. A former federale who'd retired after too many years of fighting cartels and corruption, he understood the value of privacy and asked no questions about the famous actor and Native American woman who'd appeared in his valley with enough cash to buy land and enough wariness to suggest they were running from something. "Any word from your contacts?" Ayana asked as Miguel's truck approached. Stephen nodded. "Agent Morrison transferred to a desk job in Washington. Seems the investigation into your case quietly disappeared when some journalists started asking questions about the massacre on the reservation." "And Prescott?" "Last I heard, he was arrested for trying to shake down other celebrities for money, claiming he had evidence of them harboring fugitives." Stephen's smile was grim. "Turns out the FBI doesn't appreciate freelancers making their job harder." Ayana stood and walked to the window, watching the sun climb higher over their small piece of paradise. Stephen joined her, his arm around her waist, both of them looking out at the life they'd built from ashes and pain. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Giving up your career, your old life?" Stephen considered the question seriously. His agent had stopped calling months ago. His Hollywood friends had written him off as another casualty of the industry's brutal lifestyle. His bank accounts were frozen pending federal investigation, though his lawyers assured him the charges would eventually be dropped for lack of evidence. "Never," he said, meaning it completely. That life was about pretending to be a hero. This is about actually being one. Ayanna turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes that held all the love and trust he'd never thought he deserved. "Then we're both heroes," she said. "Because you saved me, and I saved you right back." As Miguel's truck pulled up to their house, kicking up dust and breaking the morning stillness, Stephen reflected on how much had changed since that day he'd found her hanging from the Joshua tree. He'd lost his fame, his fortune, and his country. But he'd gained something infinitely more valuable, a woman who loved him for who he was rather than who he pretended to be, and the chance to be the kind of man his sister would have been proud to call brother. "Stephen," Ayanna said, her voice carrying a note of excitement as she watched Miguel climb out of his truck with a huge grin on his weathered face. "What is it?" "I think Miguel has news." Indeed, the older man was practically bouncing with excitement as he approached their porch, waving a newspaper over his head. "Amigos," he called out in heavily accented English. "You're going to want to see this." The headline on the Mexico City paper was in Spanish, but Stephen's language skills were good enough to translate, "American journalist exposes government cover-up of reservation massacre." Below it was a photo of a familiar face, Sarah Kellerman, the photographer whose death had started the whole nightmare. But she wasn't dead. She was very much alive, standing next to a federal prosecutor and holding up documents that detailed the corruption scheme her supposed murder had been designed to cover up. "She faked her death," Ayanna whispered, reading over Stephen's shoulder. "She faked her own death to expose the truth." The article detailed how Sarah Kellerman had discovered that federal officials were embezzling millions of dollars meant for reservation infrastructure. When she'd gotten too close to the truth, corrupt agents had staged her death and blamed it on the Native Americans who'd been asking too many questions about the missing money. "It says here that 17 federal agents have been arrested," Stephen continued reading. "Including Agent Morrison and the entire team that carried out the massacre." Ayanna sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face, not tears of sadness, but of vindication, of justice finally served. "My father's name will be cleared," she whispered. "My family's honor will be restored." Miguel patted her shoulder gently. "There's more, Mija. The American government is offering full pardons to any survivors of the massacre. And there's talk of a settlement, money to rebuild what was destroyed." Stephen felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. They could go home if they wanted. Ayanna could return to what remained of her people, could help rebuild from the ashes of tragedy. "What do you want to do?" he asked her, genuinely uncertain what her answer would be. Ayanna stood and walked to the window again, looking out at their small ranch, their quiet life, their carefully tended garden where desert flowers bloomed against all odds. "I want to stay," she said finally. "This is home now. This is where our children will be born, where we'll grow old together." She turned back to him, smiling through her tears. "But I also want to make sure the world knows the truth about what happened. About my father, my brothers, all the innocent people who died." Stephen nodded, understanding. They would stay in their sanctuary, but they wouldn't hide anymore. The truth had set them free in ways that went beyond legal pardons and government settlements. "Miguel," Stephen said, "think you could help us set up some kind of communication system? I have a feeling we're going to be talking to a lot of journalists in the coming months." The older man grinned. "Sí, amigo. It would be my honor." As the three of them sat on the porch, planning how to share Ayanna's story with the world, Stephen marveled at the strange turns life could take. He'd started as a man running from his past, trying to find meaning in the desert wilderness. Now he was part of something bigger, a story of love triumphing over hatred, truth conquering lies, and the kind of justice that didn't come from courts or governments but from people willing to stand up for what was right. You know what this means, don't you? Ayanna said, leaning against his shoulder as the sun climbed higher. What's that? She placed his hand over her belly again, smiling with a joy that seemed to light up the entire desert. Our child is going to be born into a world where her grandfather is remembered as a hero instead of a victim. Where her heritage is something to be proud of instead of something to hide from. Stephen kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, the promise of their future together. Comment below and let us know what you think about Stephen and Ayanna's story, he said, looking directly into an imaginary camera with the instincts of someone who'd spent decades in front of them. Do you believe love can overcome hate? Have you ever had to choose between safety and doing what's right? Share your thoughts with respect for others' experiences, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Ayanna laughed, swatting his arm playfully. Are you seriously doing a YouTube outro right now? Old habits, Stephen grinned. But I mean it. This story, our story, it matters. And if it helps even one person find the courage to stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. They both understood that their love story was also a call to action, a reminder that heroes weren't born in Hollywood studios but in moments when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things. As Miguel drove away and they settled into the quiet rhythm of their afternoon, Stephen reflected on how different his life looked now compared to 6 months ago. He traded red carpets for red sunsets, movie premieres for morning coffee with the woman he loved, and the hollow applause of strangers for the genuine respect of neighbors who valued character over celebrity. It was, he realized, the best trade he'd ever made. The baby kicked, a tiny flutter against Ayanna's belly that made them both laugh with wonder and anticipation. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out across the desert, its voice carrying on the wind like a blessing, like a promise that some things, love, truth, the courage to do what's right, were worth any sacrifice.